right, welcome back to the Yogic Studies podcast. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and today we have the special privilege of being joined by a true legend in the field, Dr. George Michell. Dr. Michell is one of the world's foremost authorities on Indian art and architecture. He's the author of numerous important books, articles, chapters on so many topics on the Hindu temple, the early Chalukyas of Badami, Hampi, Vijayanagara, and so on. His work has been deeply influential for my own studies of Indian art history, temples, and architecture. And we're so pleased, George is going to be offering a new course for us here at Yogic Studies entitled The Sacred Architecture of the Deccan. So George, a warm welcome to Yogic Studies. How are you doing today? Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'm in London and it's a sort of Indian weather, and you're on the West Coast in another weather, yes.
That's right. And the last time we saw each other in person was this past winter at your lovely home in Goa. We met at your little beach shack there, and it was a wonderful encounter. My family was traveling with me, so you got to meet my wife and kids and my in-laws. I know you spend most winters in Goa or in India these days, but take us back, if you will, to the beginning. Do you recall your first trip to India? How did all of this get started for you?
Well, Seth, I wasn't brought up with any consciousness of Asia or India until I went to architecture school, and we had a professor who was an Indonesianist, and he put on a course of sort of Asian architecture. And we saw pictures of, all sorts of things in India, the Middle East, Far East, Southeast Asia. And I got to sort of taste a little bit for these things. And then there was, just before I was 21, there was a student exchange. Australian students went to India, Indian students went to Australia. So a whole bunch of us went to India. This is now at the end of 1965, the mid of the 60s. And so I ended up in India with these students, and nothing was organized. And I thought, as a student of architecture, why don't I just break loose and go off and visit historical sites which have buildings?
Mm.
I didn't know very much, went to a library, saw pictures, and I traveled around all over India and ended up in Calcutta, and then went back to Melbourne via Bangkok and Angkor. Anyhow, that has awakened my interest in Indian architecture, architectural traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. And when I finished architecture and I started my work in an office, I realized that this didn't suit me at all. I'd rather pursue my interests in historical Asian architecture. And I was advised to leave Australia, and one of the places I could go to was SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which is where I went and then developed my interests. So that's how it sort of slightly accidentally, I would say.
So as an architecture student, you kind of fell into India through the back door.
Well, Australia didn't have history, didn't have exotic landscapes the way, let's say, Orissa, the Deccan, Cambodia, these were such fascinating places. And so I came to London and I had to do something called a PhD. Well, I didn't know what a PhD was, but they explained to me that you have to have a particular topic of specialization, that you have to choose. The British system was you had to choose. They didn't want to get involved in the choice, but once you've chosen, they would then support you. And I had been on that trip in 65, 66 to the Badami area. And then I was thinking, what could I choose? And those temples, well, because you've been there with students, they are particularly beautiful, particularly diverse. They're close to each other. They're well preserved. There are different styles. There are many fascinating things about them. So I suggested that I would do work on the Badami Chalukya temples. The trouble was nobody in London knew about them. So I had to argue why they were what they were and why they were worth studying.
And at that time, I imagine very little scholarship in English had been written on those cave temples. Is that right?
There was some material, from the British. There was a few drawings, a map.
Hmm.
There was old photographs from the 19th century. The inscriptions had been translated, the ones that mattered.
Yeah.
So there was a bit of basic data, but not dramatic. But there was no overall survey of those temples, which is what I proposed to do.
So tell us a little bit more about what's special about those temples, sometimes called cave temples. What's unique about Badami? What pulled you in to end up writing your dissertation on that?
Well, you see, they are the earliest, best preserved examples of Hindu temple architecture in India. It's not that there aren't earliest ones, but they're isolated and they're very damaged. The structural temples at Aihole and Pattadakal are particularly well preserved. And they're also, as you have noted, they're in different styles. So by studying those temples, you're doing a little bit of North Indian style and a
Hmm.
little bit of South Indian style. And you have all the sculptures. There's so much about them, and they're quite close to each other, these sites. It was a 1 hour bus ride from
Mm.
Badam to Pattadakal, where we went each morning. So one could be based somewhere and do all of these temples. And for my thesis, I did the structural temples, not the cave temples, though, of course, I studied them too, because they were better known.
Hmm.
They because there were these various books on cave temples of India.
So
That was,
today, when students or visitors, when you go to visit these temples, they're now ASI sites. You pay a ticket for admission to get in. Maybe there's a little bit of a museum. They're in conservation or being curated more or less depending on the site. But I can imagine in the 60s and 70s, it was a very different story. I mean, what was it like to visit
well,
Badami or
they were
Pattadakal?
under protection,
They were.
but um, many of the village houses in Aihole and Pattadakal were built up to the temples,
And
and
still,
people
still
lived
to
in the
this day,
temples.
so
Oh,
right?
barely. But I mean, in those days, so they were clearing the temples. I can remember, we were measuring up something which had been previously a house. And there's a famous temple in Aihole called the Lad Khan Temple, because there was a Mr. Lad Khan living in it when it was first documented. So it's nothing to do with the religious belief. So,
Wow.
um, and yes, I mean, it was quite, they were sort of clearing the site. There were no gardens, there were no tickets, there was no barbed wire, or what you have today. So, but I had to get a permission to do it. And we got step ladders, we got tape measures, we did things that nobody today would do, climbed all over the temples, up onto the roofs, up onto the towers. There were three of us who did this. Found two other young architects to come with me, and we did all these measured drawings together.
And at that time, there was no AI tools or other, you
Oh
know,
no,
so
oh no, no, it was all
everything was being done by hand, right?
yes. I mean, all the measurements had to be done with tape measures and ladders. It was very much well, I guess a hands-on. Yes, it was very physical. But Seth, we were young.
Mm.
We sort of. I had my 26th birthday, I think, when I began the work. So there you go. It's a long time ago.
So in your 2014 book, which I actually have right here, which I believe was the kind of outgrowth of the dissertation, but this beautiful book, Temple Architecture and Art
Right.
of the Early Chalukyas. You look at Badami, Mahakuta, Aihole, and Pattadakal, all sites that we take students of yogic studies to actually on our Sacred Sites of Karnataka tour, and really are just some of my favorite places in India. They're just extraordinary. In this book, you argue that the cave temples at Badami and Aihole were likely cut by guilds of artisans and workmen who perhaps had migrated from places like Ajanta and Elephanta and Ellora um, to these Chalukya sites in Karnataka. Um, What do you make of this, or how did you come to that argument? How do we know that these were sort of shared artisan guilds that were working across these vastly different sites across various parts of the Deccan and constructing sites for sacred monuments for different religious traditions, sometimes in very close proximity to each other?
Well, it's basically evidence of the monuments. We don't have the historical data. We don't know the names of the guilds or where they came from. But you see, the rock cut tradition in what is now Maharashtra, you mentioned Elephanta and Ellora and other places, it goes back earlier in time. And we have similar sort of architectural motifs and column forms and decorative things which come from those areas into this further southern sites. And we know that the temples in Badami date from, the late 500s, whereas they're earlier before.
Mm.
But you see, the Chalukyas also controlled what is now a lot of Maharashtra. So when their kingdom expanded, they incorporated these areas where such people with those sorts of skills would have been available. And we know there are rock cut monuments in Tamil country, but they're actually later. They're not earlier. So we think this is where these ideas come from. And we could show you column forms and particular motifs which suggest this connection. But again, it has to be the evidence of the architecture and the details is our prime concern.
And what do you make of the kind of multi-religious proximity and building project here? Like, for example, at Badami, you climb up the steps, and that first cave is this glorious Hindu cave, and you have this beautiful dancing multi-armed Nataraja, dancing Shiva. And then you kind of walk down a little bit further and climb your way up, and there's this exquisite Jain temple with all the Tirthankaras of the Jain tradition. At places like Ellora in particular, you really have these very sophisticated Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain complexes, all, as you say, in very close proximity by a short bus or even walking. What does that tell us kind of about, these as living sacred monuments during their time, being in such close proximity to these different religious orders?
Well, we think of them as separate religions. We think of the cult of Vishnu as quite separate from the cult of Hindu gods like Shiva and the Jain Tirthankaras. But you see, I think many of these rulers and the people who were in power had multiple interests and wanted to bring in parts of the population that had worshipped these different gods. I don't think they were as separate as we like to think of them, because I think there's a sort of rather contemporary way of classifying religions according to these different cults. But they were probably multi-cult sort of rulers. And they had to be because there were so many different things going on within their kingdoms. But as far as we know in the Badami caves, they're more or less of the same period. We have no evidence that people have argued the sequence, but they're basically, late 500s, early 600s. So, and at Laura, as you know, they overlap chronologically. We have a vague sequence, but we can't be precise about that.
Right. I think that's a great point. Sometimes those categories and religious identities that we think are so strong, perhaps are more modern formations, and that the idea of having multiple religious identities, or certainly a kingdom, and a king or a ruler who would have patronized multiple religious communities, seems.
I think that the worship of these different gods has something to do with the people who worship them. So if you want to incorporate these different peoples into your realm, you incorporate the gods or goddesses they worship. So I think that, this is also an imperial model. We have it in ancient Rome. All the shrines to the different gods of the empire are all there because they represent the gods that the people of the empire worshipped. So I think this is, this is how you rule. You allow these different things to coexist. You sponsor them, support them.
Speaking of the people who used and worshipped at these sites, can you say a little bit about that? You know, something like Badami, for example, they are these caves that require a bit of a climb and an ascent to get to. They're not like kind of just your local temple shrine that you would visit.
Oh, no. And they're very high quality, and they would have cost a lot of money. And we know at least in one of them there was royal sponsorship. The prince, his brother was the king, sponsored them. So whether they were used only by courtly royal people, it was an elite usage, or it was sort of popular usage, is something we don't have much knowledge about. Whereas Pattadakal was a royal site. It's where, kings built temples all to Shiva, because Shiva and the linga are something to do with royal commemoration, all facing east, all next to each other, all built by different kings. It was like a sort of a special site. It probably wasn't a popular, everyday worship place. It must be something for the elite, I would have thought,
Mm.
because it was part of the royal, we could imagine. And all those inscriptions, local people couldn't read them. So they were for just that upper part of the educated and powerful population. And the fact that temples were identified with royal figures, also we have some evidence of this because in Badami we have a couple of temples that were dismantled. And it would seem that when the Pallavas, the rulers from Tamil Nadu, who invaded and occupied Badami for a while, they dismantled the temples that represented the power of the Chalukyas. And then when the Chalukyas kicked the Pallavas out, they went back into building temples too. So there was all this thing of attacking each other's temples, which happens in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my temple's bigger than yours.
Well, no, my temple, I'm invading your country. Here is a temple representing your power, your authority, by putting an inscription, my inscription on it, or dismantling it, or robbing it of its treasures. I am therefore asserting my authority over yours. And we have, of course, as you know, Pallavas left inscriptions at Badami, the Chalukyas left inscriptions at Kanchipuram, where the Pallavas were. There was a lot of this sort of thing going on.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about kind of the evidence that we have for, let's say, for dating some of these sites. You mentioned inscriptions. Of course, we have the architecture of the buildings themselves, but sometimes there's very little evidence to go on, right?
Yes, and there's art historians are very obsessed with chronology. That's the thing they like to play with.
Right.
When is this done? And for the Chalukyas, we have a few key dates which we hang on to. But when I was proposing my PhD subject to the committee in the London University, there was a Sanskritist who said, if there isn't an inscription on it, which anyhow I couldn't read because I wasn't very good at Sanskrit, he says, how can you study this if there's no inscription on it? What else is there to study?
Right.
And I had to say to him, architecture is a language too, and my job as an architecture person is to decode that and to work out the sequence of how things could be built. But so we do have a very broad chronology, but there are many temples that people are still arguing about. And we just have to accept the fact that we don't really know.
So let's talk a little bit about Hampi now, which I really want to hear about from you, because as you know, Hampi is a very dear place for me. I think we first came into contact actually because of the research I was doing on the sculptures of yogis and ascetics on the temple pillars at Hampi. When I began studying and researching Hampi, I immediately began reading everything that you and John and your colleagues had written on the subject. So I'm incredibly indebted to all of the pioneering work that you did on this subject. But I know it wasn't easy, and it's really changed as a site over the years. So how did you first come to Hampi and then end up, working with John Fritz and developing the Vijayanagara research project?
Well, again, this was sort of accidental. After I finished my PhD, my work at Badami, I did various projects, including a very extensive Bengal project. And then I went for a couple of visits to Hampi in the 70s. There was nowhere to stay. And I had the impression this was a fantastic place that had only been very little served in terms of scholarship of architecture and art. And it also was a complete city, it wasn't just a temple here and a temple there, it was a whole ensemble. So little by little, I formulated the idea of why don't we do a little bit of work at Hampi, get a few architecture students, get a photographer, put a few materials together and make an issue of Marg magazine. The Bombay art magazine.
Mm.
So I went to Mulk Raj Anand, who was the editor, and said, well, what about doing a volume on Hampi? And he said, oh, it's all too late. It's not that interesting. It's not like Cholas and Guptas. Anyhow, so, but I went ahead, and then through a set of circumstances, I hadn't met John yet, including an Australian photographer, a hippie who arrived, from Goa slightly out of his head, but who was a Sanskrit student from Munich, a
Mm.
girl who arrived on a motorbike, and she said she wanted to stay, somebody who taught conservation in Delhi. Suddenly there was a group of people, and we started to measure a little bit. There were lots of things that had never been mapped. There was nowhere to stay. It was all very rough. And then Mulk Raj Anand drove through the site. He was on his way to Badami to do a bit of photography. He saw these boys and girls, foreigners and Indians, all doing these drawings and all this sort of thing. And he just loved this energy and this sort of improvisation of this event. So we put these materials together for this volume of Marg. And then I thought, well, really, this shouldn't be the end. I should go back again. And then I met John Fritz, the American archaeologist. We met in London. John was free. He was interested. He'd never been to India. So he came. And then some of those people came back, and then other friends came. And because the site was so magical, you'll know about this, it had a fantastic magnetism. People loved to go there. It was an adventure,
Mm.
And then we were able to get a tented camp. And so year after year, we attracted all these students and developed a systematic way of recording the site, mapping the site. But it didn't start off as a project with a clear idea. It evolved like that. And in the end, we had about 20 years. So in the December, January, February months, we had a camp. We had up to 20 people, volunteers. They came from all over India, architecture students, archaeology students,
Mm.
from Australia, from the UK, from US, various countries. Nobody got paid.
Mm.
John was able to harness a bit of Smithsonian rupees to pay for the camp and the car and the food. So it was a very special sort of 19th century type project,
Because at that time, there were no cafes, Mango
No,
Tree
no, no.
Cafe. There was no real provisions and infrastructure, right?
Well, there was very, very primitive things in the bazaar at Hampi for the pilgrims.
Yeah,
So you could get a cup of tea there, but
sure.
we stayed near the Lotus Mahal in the archaeology Royal Centre area, and there was absolutely nothing there. So it was a hardship, but over the years it got a little bit more comfortable. And then, through the 80s, then people started to take more notice. UNESCO got interested in the site, and then it was
Mm.
declared a World Heritage Site with some of our maps,
Mm.
and people started to come. But we were there as the site sort of grew in popularity, and we had this marvelous photographer came, and so we started to give talks. We were the first people to give illustrated talks on Hampi Vijayanagara wherever we went. People became interested. How could you not be interested? Of course. So
And so many important publications that came out, edited volumes, many
so we were
beautiful
very
guidebooks.
yeah, we did all this. John and I were not involved with courses at institutions,
Hmm.
so we were very interested in publishing our materials using publications as a way of disseminating, and we were able to do a series of monographs using other scholars, and we did guidebooks. We did so many different sorts of things, including most recently like a big coffee table, another big coffee table book. So we do things at different levels, and encouraged other scholars to do research on aspects. Somebody came and wanted to work on hydraulics.
Mm.
Somebody did on fortifications. Anna Dalla Piccola did iconography of temple
Hmm.
sculpture. And then two American archaeologists. They worked on pottery and on water management. So there were so many interesting things you could do with Hampi. And I think that's what John and I contributed, really, if I look back on it. We demonstrated this was a place you could do many different sorts of investigations, which could then be applied to other sites. So we were really keen to show what you could do with this place in terms of research, not just by us, but, people who came. And because we had a tented camp, people could actually stay there and work, which wasn't possible until we got ourselves organized.
Yeah, it's almost hard for me to imagine that time period. I mean, now, when I show up in the 2010s and I'm looking, for dates, I'm looking for inscriptions, I'm looking at the maps. I have all of that material available to me because of the work that you guys have done.
I mean, the inscriptions many of them had been translated
Translated.
because, there's a long tradition in India when, especially under the British, the thing they started with everywhere were the written records.
Mm-hmm.
So many of these had in fact been translated, but they weren't all particularly useful. But John and I couldn't read medieval Kannada, which is the language in which many of them are written, but there were lots of local specialists who could, and they came on board.
So looking back at all of that, I'm sure there were so many discoveries from the mundane, from waterways and sewage and things like that to city planning and, religious iconography, so many different things about kingship and quotidian everyday life during the Vijayanagara period. What would you say, though, or when people ask you, or when you reflect on it, like what are some of the kind of big findings or takeaways that that weren't known perhaps before this work began on Hampi?
Well, I think perhaps one of the big what would you call views or vistas of the site that we promoted is that this was an imperial capital. This was a big city from which an empire was ruled. And it had different zones. It wasn't laid out like a shastric geometric city in the text. This was something quite different. It responded to the landscape. You've been there, you could understand that. So this is something that we understood. And that in fact, you could, from the monuments, from the imagery on the monuments and the range of monuments, start to understand something about the culture. The fact that in the royal part of the site, there were all these buildings which had these sultanate, these Islamic type elements. What were they doing there in the middle of a Hindu imperial city? So that softened our idea of this Hindu-Muslim conflict view of the Deccan, that in fact this was a cosmopolitan city which reached out to different cultures. Chinese ceramics have been found.
Mm-hmm.
Elephant stables were built like Muslim tombs. There was in fact a Muslim population in the city. There are mosques and things. That this was a sort of a highly diverse, not only population and polity, but there was a highly diverse architecture and the conception of how a city could work. So these were things that I don't think people really understood or thought about much before we did the work.
You mentioned the pilgrims that would come, and still to this day, right? Because the Virupaksha temple is still very much a living, active Hindu temple, especially at big festival times. But there's quite a continuous record of worship there. How do you kind of negotiate that, or were there any challenges kind of that were brought up during this work of kind of surveying, sacred sites, sacred temples, active Hindu temples of worship?
Well, you see, these Vijayanagara rulers, they exploited the mythological and legendary associations of the site. So you have the Virupaksha, Shaivite, the Shiva Pampa local gods. Then there's the Ramayana associations. This is the Kishkinda, according to local beliefs, the monkey kingdom. So these were all sort of ingredients that were inherent in the site. And their idea to give themselves power and legitimacy was to sponsor and develop these things. So the Virupaksha temple was very much enlarged and, embellished by the Vijayanagara kings. They also built temples to various aspects of Rama. They also brought in other cults which were not indigenous to the site, like Tiruvengalanath or Venkateshwara.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big Venkateshwara temple there, but this god was never worshipped at this site before.
Mm.
But again, it must represent a community that was brought into the empire, and a temple was built to this god. Interestingly enough, Seth, the only temples that are in current worship today are those which are the indigenous cults of the site.
Mm-hmm.
All these imported religious systems or cults have fallen away because they really relied on an imperial structure for them to work. So the Virupaksha temple, as you know, is highly active and and pilgrims do these Ramayana walks through the site and visit the caves and hilltops,
Right.
pond, the mountaintop where Hanuman
Hanuman.
was born, and all that sort of thing. Yes.
Yeah, I was
And
just thinking.
hill.
Speaking of politicians sprinkling religious ingredients
Ah,
onto sites, even recently, I think there was a big BJP rally at Hanuman's birthplace up the hill there on that temple because, of course, Vijayanagara as a quote unquote Hindu stalwart kingdom that fought off an imposing Muslim north. This idea becomes powerful for a kind of a certain Hindu political vision today, but this was not historically the case.
well,
Is
it
that
probably was. There were all sorts of, you know, who has it? Who has written about the Ramayana, the way in which the Ramayana is brought into politics at moments of crisis,
Mm,
and it's something to do with the big Rama temple in the middle of the palace area that seems to have been introduced at a crisis in the politics and wars of the period. This sort of who was the Sanskritist at Columbia who wrote about this? Whom I think Shelley
Sheldon
Pollock.
Pollock, yeah.
Yes, Sheldon Pollock wrote marvelously about the way the Ramayana has been surfaced and brought into play in certain political moments. And this is true at Hampi. We have this wonderful Rama temple, you may recall, the so-called Rama temple,
Oh yeah.
which has all the belief, the story. But as you go in, Seth, you probably know, as you walk into the temple, there is a Sanskrit, not a Sanskrit inscription in Devanagari,
Mm,
which says the king, like previous kings in the past, was protected by the goddesses. And Pampa is the goddess that protects him. So he's more or less saying, even though I'm building a temple to Rama, because Rama is very important, I'm still connected with Virupaksha and Pampi at Hampa.
mm-hmm.
So there's all these interesting ways of connecting these cults. And I like to see them within a historical and political and even economic, or even military context, because that explains the patronage, the money to build these things.
Mm.
And Hampi has a huge amount of these examples.
There's some fascinating yogi sculptures at the Hazarama temple too, which
Oh,
is
is
what
that
I'm
so?
always
Okay.
looking for. Like, oh yeah,
Right.
Rama
And
and inscription and
the Achyutarama temple would be a good one for you.
yes,
But,
there's some there for sure.
but that's the Venkateshwara temple. You see, that's all to do with Tirupati.
Yeah,
You see, that
which was
cult
brought in, you're saying, from
was brought in.
outside.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We have
that
we have
makes
this.
sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. Wow. So incredible. So tell us, I mean, what happened at the end of that project? Did the kind of funding run out, or your interests went elsewhere? And
Well,
then what?
after 20 odd years, that those rupee funds that we were able to access, they sort of drifted out. And we'd done
Yeah.
20 years, it was enough. And we needed time, not with groups of students at the camp, but sort of writing up, and John had to finish his archaeological atlas. So that's when we decided, instead of just going to Goa for a week, as we used to for R&R from Hampi,
Mm,
we would relocate there for the winter and go up to Hampi as we needed to, and not be responsible for running a sort of, field school, so to speak.
right.
So we spent all those years, and as you know, I'm still in Goa, and that's where a lot of the material was edited, put together, and John finished his work on the atlas and that sort of thing.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense.
And we
Need
were
time to
also
digest.
also we were old, we couldn't do it anymore.
Of
Getting too
course.
tricky.
Of
Yeah.
course. When was the last time you went to Hampi?
No, I was there early this year, so I do
Oh,
go
okay.
each year.
Okay.
I very often go for a few days, take people around,
Yeah,
which I don't like to do very much anymore because
I know. Well,
the
I'm gonna
site's
try
not
to
like it
twist
used
your
to
arm. I'm
be.
gonna see if I can get you to come out and join us,
Okay.
because that would be such a privilege. As you go today, though, and as you think about the future at sites like Hampi, do you have any concerns, or do you think that it's being kind of curated
Well,
or taken care of in the right ways, or what do you think
I
about
think,
these sites?
the problem is, quite apart from the actual conservation and the management of the fabric of
Mm,
the building, it, the site is not properly organized for the thousands of visitors who come daily with all the traffic, the facilities and all that. So it's
no.
not really um, organized. We would have been very pleased to see a sort of visitors center
Yeah.
where everybody went to begin with, got a ticket for the site, where you have, let's say, electric vehicles going around the site. There was some sort of management of movement, but this so far hasn't happened. And so the site suffers from too many people. Before we used to complain, Seth, there was no money, the site was abandoned, nothing ever happened.
Yeah.
And now we look back on that as the sort of golden era
Of course. Nobody was
because
there. Nobody cared. You
well, I
could.
mean, or they cared very just minimally.
Yeah.
But when there's money, then there start to be interventions. And there have been a few disasters at the site,
Mm,
so which I don't, have to go into, but I mean, there have been some real mistakes.
mm,
And one of the problems is, I think that, I don't know if it's just in Hampi, uh, decisions are not made with discussions and if somebody makes a decision and does it. As you know, the Hampi Bazaar, all the shops, everything were demolished and leaving this sort of forlorn colonnade. All the whole, activity of tourists and pilgrims around the temple has been completely, destroyed because a local commissioner decided that they were illegal and had them shoved, and people lost their shops and their where, and this was not something that UNESCO permitted. They said UNESCO said you have to have dealings with the local stakeholders to make these interventions. But somebody in India just did it, got the police, got the army, and kicked everybody out.
mm.
You have been there, you've seen what happened,
Yeah.
and that's really sad because it was a messy, vibrant, wonderful, sort of exciting part, and it was traditional. These were bazaars, these were messy, where
Yeah.
pilgrims went. After all, pilgrims were the first tourists, if you think about it.
Of
They were the
course.
first visitors. And
Yeah.
they needed water, they needed somewhere to stay, and they needed food, and they needed things for worship and all that sort of thing. So that's all been disrupted.
Mm.
And for me, it's a shame because we had such a lot of fun there in the past. That's
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine that golden age of early
Well,
early research in the field. And
well, also, not dereliction, but very little intervention. There were some things that shouldn't have happened. And we as foreigners with permits to document the site, we were not in a position to get up and make a noise and go into newspapers and say things. That was not for us to do.
mm. So, kind of connecting threads between the early Chalukyas and your dissertation, decades of work at Hampi. In between and after, though, your work has also ranged enormously, from looking at Mughal gardens, Islamic architecture of the Deccan, Hoysala temples, late temple architecture more broadly. As you look back at this incredible career, is there kind of a particular thread or theme that you think kind of unites all of this work, or have you done many different things?
I've done many different things, and you see, I quite like it when a project which I don't know about, an opportunity comes. Like I worked on brick temples of Bengal. I don't know if you know about this part of my life. There
No.
was another big project. Well, this came to me under a different sort of set of circumstances. I knew nothing about Bengal, both Bengals, and the local temple architecture, but I had the chance to work with an archive and I started zero. I had to learn it. When it came to Mughal gardens, I didn't know much about them. I had to learn about it. So each of these projects is a sort of an investigation, an immersion in a topic. And I'm that sort of person who likes to do that sort of research. I'm a researcher. I
Mm.
like to find out. try to make up my mind, maybe with other fellow scholars and photographers, and put it together into some shape, like a book or a report. So
Hmm.
that's the way I operate. I've always operated ever since, 50 last years. And under some circumstances, a lot of these big projects were in this peninsular part of India, because in the end, Karnataka especially has the most diverse architectural traditions. That is, the most different type of things are happening there
Hmm.
due to some circumstance of geography and history. If you go to Gujarat, the temples are all more or less the same over many, many years, or Rajasthan.
Mm.
You know, you go to Orissa, they're all of a certain type. You go to Tamil Nadu, you have a Tamil type. But
Right.
in the Deccan, Karnataka especially, you have Muslim architecture, you have early Chalukya, you have Hampi, you have Hoysala. There are incredible amount of different things happening. And so this is some reason that I've been attracted on different occasions to work there.
And that's one of the unique things about the early Chalukyas, right, in Karnataka at like Pattadakal, right? Is that the case that they kind of blended these northern and southern styles of architecture?
So they saw themselves also as bringing traditions in from different parts of India and developing them, and then influencing others. I think probably the Chalukyas influenced the early Pallavas, and they also influenced the Rashtrakutas. If you go to Ellora and see that incredible
Yeah.
Kailash
Yeah.
monolith,
Yeah.
that's a sort of neo-Chalukya monument. It's laid
Yeah.
out like a Pattadakal temple. So it's a very creative part of India in terms of architectural design. This is something which I've discovered
Since you
again.
mentioned since you mentioned Alora and Kailasanatha, I have to ask you, since if you go online, or you go on YouTube, or I see this on social media even, people love to kind of overreact to the grandeur, the sophistication of the Kailasanatha temple, and they think surely this must have been built by some superior technology, some non-humans or something, because
Yes,
there's no way that humans could have built this, over 1,000 years ago, chiseling by hand this huge, sophisticated Hindu temple carved out of a single mountainside, right? What do you make of these overreactions, and what
well,
what
I mean,
can?
it's a bit like the pyramids, I mean, people want to think it's more exciting for them to think it's an extraterrestrial or a non-human intervention. But we can be sure of one thing, that the Kailash was scooped out of the mountain by teams of workmen.
Mm.
There can be no doubt. Yes, yes. This is sort of, we don't. This is not scholarship. This is sort of imagination.
And what
And
what kind of what kind of tools would they have been using to
well,
do that?
probably quite. I think this is something again. This is a little bit beyond me technologically, but
Hmm.
they were iron, and they were quite simple, I think. But they developed these technologies for scooping out of basalt, which is a very hard rock, or down in the Pallava area, granite and all sorts of different tools. But the Indians were magnificently skilled. It's a bit like the ancient Egyptians. They had these very difficult stones to work with and created amazingly perfect, architectures. But that cut out monolithic Kailas must be one of the wonders of the world, I would have thought.
Absolutely.
Astonishing, yeah.
Do you get the sense, as a historian of architecture, has our human creativity and ingenuity and skill declined in some ways? When you go, this is the amazing thing about India and Indian temples and architecture, is you get this incredible blast from the past, and these incredible monuments, some of which have really stood the test of time. And then you look at a modern Indian city, or even, American city, or for that matter, and you think, look at this boring, unsophisticated architecture and buildings and urban decay, and you can't help but yearn for the past. And so while we've of course evolved technologically and in so many other ways as society, when you look at the architecture, what do you think? Have we lost something?
Well, we must have lost a great deal of skills, but of course, in parts of India, people are still carving wood in an amazing way or painting in a particular, India hasn't lost all of its artistic traditions. Some of them have evolved. But I mean, people in India were always extremely skilled. I mean, they had a whole mechanism for perfecting techniques and transmitting ideas. And I think it's a shame that so much of India today is unaesthetic. Modern Indian cities can be a whole nightmare of
Mm,
rubbish architecture, mess, pollution, all the things that we hate. And when we go to these ancient sites and we have beautiful carvings, beautifully preserved, we are refreshed aesthetically and we're amazed at the technology of these marvelous buildings. Yes, it's a shame, but maybe it's true, in Europe. You think of the Gothic cathedrals, or you go to Greece and you think of the marvelous things, and you look
mm,
at a modern Greek town, it's you can think the same thing.
absolutely. So, George, for somebody listening to this, maybe who's a grad student or thinking about pursuing grad school, or just an independent, curious learner or scholar, somebody who has been to India maybe and has been also struck by some of these sites, and they want to pursue further study or maybe even a career in this line of
As
work. What looking back at your career, and I'm sure you get this from time to time of some grad students seeking advice, but what kind of advice do you have for younger people trying to enter into this field?
Well, I think if you're going to think of this as a career where you're going to make money and get security and that sort of life, I don't think these subjects offer many opportunities. They didn't for me. But I think if you're interested in an adventure and you can afford in terms of your personal time and maybe your economics to spend time in India, travel and see things and think about things, I think India is still one of the most marvelous parts of the world because you can travel a lot. There's a great deal that you can see. It is compared to other parts of the world that you can't travel in anymore. You can't do this in other countries nearby. So India is still very privileged. And also it's a country where I think as a foreigner, if you're not Indian, it's relatively easy. People are quite welcoming.
Mm,
If there's not language, people are still helpful. It's got that sort of backup. So if you want to travel and see things, I can't tell you how much more in India there is that I have seen, and I've
mm,
seen a lot,
mm.
but we've never seen it all. And so students can be encouraged. There are more things to see, more things to think about than there's still lots to do. So I think they would be encouraged. It's not all done. I think that's the important thing.
Right.
There's more to see, more to think about. And um, even though, and I'm very happy to maybe the courses, I will give for you might stimulate students to think about this. And I'll be very happy to interact with anybody who would like to go on and do more things. But I think it's going to India, not doing it virtually. And not sitting in a library or on the screen, this sort of screen library. You've got to go and see things and experience them.
I fully agree. As somebody who runs a digital online educational platform, um, there's a lot that we can do through this medium, and this is incredible for spreading knowledge and information. But there's just no replacement for going and visiting and seeing these sites in person, which is why one of my favorite things that I get to do is lead these annual trips to
Yes,
India. And a lot of students who've been studying online or have been at university or in the texts and reading, and then you get to step into the field and you get to smell the bat dung in a cave temple, right? And there's just nothing like getting to see these places in person. Absolutely. But we do have you here for an online course, and I'm so grateful that we were able to make this happen. So tell us a little bit about what our students can expect this upcoming course, the Sacred Architecture of the Deccan.
well, it's architecture, and I thought by restricting it to this Deccan area, we could explore different avenues in terms of time and religious systems. So this is why I've sort of put together four different ways of cutting through the history and religious beliefs and systems. So we've got a Buddhist module, some of the rock cut shrines and monasteries we're going to look at, going back to the second and first centuries BC. Then we'll do Hindu cults as sponsored by the Chalukyas in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. So we'll move forward a little bit. We'll be more in Karnataka, not so much in Maharashtra. And then we'll do this Jain tradition of the Deccan, which is very special. It's quite separate from the Gujarat or Western Indian tradition, and it has also a whole series of monuments and religious systems with sculptures and shrines. So we'll do some of that, and then we'll end up with Hampi, Vijayanagara, which of course itself is a whole world of historical associations. And I think every one of these talks will look different. They won't look the same. And my job will be to try to explain these differences, the different materials, the different styles, the different periods. It'll be very visual. Each of these courses has, 50 to 60 images. So people won't be looking at me. They'll be looking at the sites and details. And I think it's one way of getting the variety and range of Indian culture in one particular zone over a particular field of architectural history. So I think it will be, and you persuaded me that I should, even though it's not a yogic, monuments, but they're all to do with the culture of India, especially this area.
Absolutely. And if we want to understand the history and the development, the roots of yoga in India, then we have to understand the civilization, the culture and traditions that it was born out of. And at so many of these sites, there is an underlying history of yoga and asceticism and kind of embodied contemplative practice that is often that can be found as a layer within these sites. I would argue, not all of them, and we don't want to project it onto places where it's not there, but it's these traditions of early Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism that the yogic traditions emerge out of.
And do I understand from you, Seth, that some of the sources that you're interested in belong to this part of India? This is an important part of India for your work.
That's right. And that was something that has surprised me in my studies. I focus in particular on what we might call medieval Hatha yoga, which seems to have emerged around the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries in the Deccan, in places like Karnataka, Maharashtra, maybe Andhra Pradesh. Previously, we had thought that Hatha yoga and the Nath yogis was mostly in the north. And we now see that the earliest texts, the earliest corpus of Sanskrit Hatha yoga literature, seem to have all been written from the Deccan. So understanding, where these came from, why they were being written, and what was going on there, all of this history is really crucial for situating that moment.
And I think that's this interest in this area from my own personal work, and then with a colleague who I knew as a student called Helen Filon, she became interested in Deccan Islamic architecture, in 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And we also realized that this was an area of India that had always been sort of not really focused on. People talk about the north, they talk about the south, but the thing in the middle was never quite it didn't attract so much attention as an individual creative zone with all these marvelous sites in various degrees of, preservation or dilapidation.
Like at Bijapur, right?
Yeah. Well, have you been to Bijapur?
Yes. So
I went. It's an amazing place. No?
I should have mentioned this. One of my first trips to the Deccan was with my professor from Harvard, Professor Gina Kim, who's a professor of Indian art and architecture and art history, Buddhist manuscripts and Tantra in particular. It was through Gina that I was first exposed to your work and to the Deccan. We did a whole seminar at Harvard on this, on rock cut architecture, and then we got approved for a field trip at Harvard, and we all got to go to these sites, including Badami and Pattadakal. We did Maharashtra as well, Elephanta, Janta, Ellora. But we also did visit some of these Islamic sites like at Bijapur in the Deccan, and they're incredible. They're really
Amazing. And you see also the problem for people who do Islamic art history. Is sort of off the edge,
mm,
or it's Mughal, it's North India, but the Deccan, which has also these amazing sites, Gulbarga, Bidar, and Bijapur, all in Karnataka, are three completely different worlds of polity and architecture. And again, this creativity, um, and this connection with other parts of the world through the coasts, you see, because they're near to the Arabian Sea and Bengal, the Bay of Bengal. So it's a very important part of India in terms of meeting and edges of culture where things overlap. And as you may know, that Adil Shah of Bijapur, he had very many yogic associations and had himself even portrayed with yogic beads and things. And when he was
mhm.
buried, they they had to say what an authentic and good Muslim he was, because obviously he had other tendencies. He was very attracted to this yogic world, and they
Mm.
didn't make sure that was sort of, somehow put to one side afterwards. Yeah. And yeah, that's another fascinating
That's
thing.
very interesting. I'll have to follow up on that. We hear about lots of the Sufi and not yogi
Yes,
interactions with
oh,
the Mughals in the north, but to think that that was also happening down south.
definitely. Oh, definitely. Yes, yes, yes. And
Yeah.
the Iranian connections, Central Asian connections, um, and that great site near Ellora you may have been to, Kuldabad, where all the great Sufi saints are buried.
Oh,
The
I haven't
whole
been there yet.
saint. Well, it's the great sacred place in the Deccan for the Sufi. And Sufism is something which flourished in India. It took because it also started to overlap with the yogic tradition. Sort of.
Absolutely.
They're all very fascinating. Yes.
George, we're almost at the end here, but I want to make sure I mention and ask you about the Deccan Heritage Foundation and these wonderful guidebooks that you've been producing. I have some of them here.
Right.
These have been fantastic. I mean, I always recommend these to students and to people traveling in India. They're so beautifully done. I know that the scholarship is reliable. The pictures are beautiful. They're small and accessible. And if you're in India, they're rupees and they're very affordable. So
Yes, yes, they're
tell,
not
tell us
expensive.
tell us
Yeah.
about this
Well,
project.
because with Helen, who had worked on Deccan Islamic architecture, and we both felt the Deccan was underappreciated as a sort of a zone with its own personality, so to speak, that we should try to do more to attract attention. And there were lots of sites that needed some help in terms of preservation, conservation, and publication. So now 11, 12 years ago, I think it is, we created this foundation. We're quite a modest outfit. We have restored some stepwells, some temples, small things. We're now doing a palace in the Mysore area, but publications became a very important part of our work. We thought this is something we can do by doing these guidebooks, which, as you very nicely said, serve the visitor. They also help promote knowledge and understanding and appreciation of these sites. And they are geared to the general reader, not only in terms of the quality of the publication and the size, but I think the information is presented, clearly, because art historical stuff, sometimes is not what visitors need when they first go to a place.
Mm.
So we do have maps and photographs. It tells you what's there. And people in India now want to know more. There's a huge, I think, young people are starting to travel, and they're not necessarily anything to do with art history. I
Yeah.
had a couple came to me and said, your map of Aihole was great because without that map, we wouldn't have seen all these places inside the village. But you must know that there are two numbers on the map that are wrong. Number 11 is actually number 12, and number 12 is number 11. Oh, I said, oh dear,
Okay.
well, I have to correct it. It was a mistake.
Second
Yes, I said,
edition.
yes. I said, it's great that young architects like you go to visit these ancient places. And they said, but we're not architects. They said, we're in the IT world,
Mm.
but we like to go on weekends out and visit these historical places.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
see, I think that's what's new in India.
Well, my father-in-law, who you met in
Yes,
Goa,
yes.
who's not a scholar but is a aficionado and loves history and loves to read. He loves reading these books because they're accessible to him. It's in a language that he can appreciate.
Well, we take this as a compliment because, that's the people we need to. I think they're young. There's a generation in India that is now open to exploring and learning, and they're nothing to do with the academic world. They're people who live in these areas and appreciate their historical, heritage. So this is what the Deccan Heritage Foundation is all about. And we're always trying to recruit money and do projects, but it's something which now is, I think, growing. And Helen has just been with a group from Ashoka University, in Delhi, on
Hmm.
a Deccan heritage tour. And they have been visiting all these sites with various scholars, and they're very excited, of course, to see all these marvelous places.
So one thing I wanted to ask you, I was just recently at Lakundi, and I know you have a new
Oh, yes.
guidebook on Lakundi, which I think our colleague, our friend Anirudh Kanaseti helped to produce as well. Is that
Well,
right?
he wrote the introduction, yes. So
When when
that's a
when
good monument.
when
Yeah.
we visited Lakundi, and this has happened at many sites, but this was just very recent. There are young students, Indian students at local schools or universities who are there and are doing line drawings of the temple architecture. And in fact,
Good.
the day that we were there were busloads of students who were at
Good.
this site. They couldn't believe we were there. They didn't, they were blown away that foreigners were there also, and very interested to know why we were interested in this
Yes,
obscure
yes.
site here. But they were holding. We were talking to the teachers and the students, and they were holding a statewide competition for students of Indian architecture on these drawings that they were doing.
Good for them. Wonderful.
And I thought, well, this was exciting. Actually, there was a lot of passion and interest from the local people and these students for their own traditions, and that excited me. I thought, okay, because you always hear that there's the opposite. You always hear that kids these days don't care about the traditions of the past or this and that. But I've experienced that there has, at least in some sectors, let's say, that there's actually quite a bit of interest. But
Oh, I think that, no, I don't think there's any shortage of interest. I think it's not always focused, so professionally. So how
yeah,
to develop the interest, and the guidebooks will at least, give them the basic framework to understand these Lakundi temples, which were measured and drawn, I think, in the early part of the 20th century. There's a book with the most beautiful drawings done by Indian specialists under British, sponsorship. There's a whole volume of drawings of Lakundi and Gadag, totally amazing drawings. So, some work was done in the past.
sure.
And do you have that new guidebook? I mean,
I don't have that one
no,
yet.
no,
We'll have
it
to
was
get it.
published just in the last few months. But when you
Yeah,
go next to it, yeah,
yeah.
you can get it as an ebook, if
Okay,
you need to.
good,
Yeah.
good. Well, George, this has been such a wonderful conversation. It's
But
always really a pleasure to chat with you. I'm really grateful for your kindness and generosity in sharing your knowledge, and we're so thrilled to have you teach this course. Anything else that you'd like to add, or didn't
oh,
get to
well, I'm
say?
looking forward. I hope that, I'll do my best with the 4 sessions that I have. And then there'll be a sort of an interaction with the people who are taking the course. They'll have their questions and things. I'll see how I can respond and be helpful. No, it'll be exciting because I don't do really much teaching. You see, I've never been part of a university course.
Mm.
So it's always been, I've done a lot of lecturing on the site, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of work with people as we toured, because
Mm-hmm.
that's the way, that's the way I've done. So it has to be visually
Yeah.
illustrated, which I hope I'll be, we've got some nice pictures for everybody, I think. Looking forward to
Absolutely.
it, Seth.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, I think it's going to be great. And
And yeah, thank you for inviting me. And I'm, looking forward to the experience of putting this together.
wonderful. Well, the course is YS 140 Sacred Architecture of the Deccan. It's going to run live for 4 weeks from September 28th through October 23rd, 2026. You'll meet live with Dr. Michell on Fridays, 10 to 11:30 Pacific time. You'll have to convert that for wherever you are. But if you're watching this in the future, then everything's been recorded. It's all available for self-study, and you can access the recordings anytime. So, George, I just want to thank you again so much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you real soon in the course. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and please, we hope to see you in class very soon.
Thank you, Seth.